Okay, growth. I'm going to read the slide first, let you copy the words, and then we'll start to discuss. Living things grow by cell division or cell enlargement. Adult organisms arise through development. Which is repeated cell division and cell differentiation. The human body has about 50 trillion cells, all from one egg and one sperm. So let me ask you this. Are any of you the same size you were when you were born? I would hope not, or your mothers would deserve gold medals. You started off little. You got it now? Okay, good. You started off as a miniature person, a tiny human. A cat starts off as a tiny cat, a miniature cat. A dog starts off as a miniature dog. A raccoon starts off as a little tiny raccoon. Miniature versions of the adult. Now, if you need to grow, we'll go with the rabbits.
What is that? What?
It's a rabbit. Hey, no art critics, huh?
I'm not
Yes, it's a little rabbit.
You're not an art picture it.
Well, okay. That's my little rabbit. So, if you're a tiny miniature rabbit, you're a miniature version of an adult organism, there are two ways that you can get bigger. Agreed? One is if you're made up of cells, you can add more cells. So you can add cells to get bigger. If you're increasing the number of cells that you've got, that happens through cell division. Okay? That's the cell division part. You can draw a little tiny person, you can draw a little tiny raccoon, I don't care what you draw. You can draw a little tiny circle, sure. You can draw an earthworm. You know, you can add cells to get bigger. The other thing you can do is grow the cells you already have. So you can also grow the cells that you already have. That is the cell enlargement. Okay? To enlarge means what?
Make bigger.
To make bigger, yeah. So you can make your individual cells bigger. So you can add more cells or you can make your cells bigger. In some cases we do both of those things. Now, in the case of a human infant, if you take a little cheek swab from a human infant and you get some cells from the inside of the cheek, those cells are pretty close to the same size as an adult human's cells. The cells are not different sizes. But the adult human has a lot more of them. Okay? Same with a rabbit or something. And a baby human looks like an adult human, but tiny. And a baby cat looks like a cat, but tiny. Not everything is like that. So there's our kittens, our cat growing. And if you look at this animal, you say, oh yeah, that's going to grow up to be this. Okay? The process is development. It develops into an adult. If you look at this thing, would you automatically think that it's going to grow up to look like that? No. So some organisms have development and they have big changes. The changes humans go through are relatively minor. Okay? But some organisms, when they go through development, have much larger changes. So development is two processes. Cell division, and that cell division is the making more cells. And we talked about that here. Cell division means you're making more cells. You're actually adding cells. Pardon? Okay, So you went from being that miniature human to being a full-sized human through the process of development. So we add more cells, but let's talk about this other word here, differentiation. So, wait, were we ready to move on? Okay. Let's imagine that this is a cell in your body. We said that a lot of your cells have special jobs to do, which means they are what? What's the word? They're specialized, okay? So they are specialized into being bone cells or muscle cells or skin cells or blood cells. They've got all these different jobs. But at some point, how many cells did you start off as? Do you know? One. You started off as one fertilized egg. So did a raccoon. So did a cat. So did an earthworm. So did a bird. One fertilized egg, one single cell. So that one single cell can become any of these things. It can become a bone cell. So it can become a bone cell or a muscle cell or a skin cell or a blood cell. This cell can become any specialized cell. This cell has a special name. You may have heard this. That cell that's not specialized, a single cell is not specialized when you're a fertilized egg. It's called a stem cell. Stem cells can cure things, yeah. They do stem cell transplants for some kinds of cancer, for leukemias, for multiple myelomas. There is some hope that stem cells might cure juvenile diabetes. If you know anybody with juvenile diabetes,
How would that cure that?
because they can be inserted into the pancreas and become a pancreas that functions correctly.
So to like make so the sugars.
So it makes, yeah, because in type 1 diabetes, how many of you know somebody with type 2 diabetes? This is usually like grandma, grandpa, older folks, usually onsets in the 40s or 50s. My uncle had type 2 diabetes. I had a whole bunch of family members with it. And so these are people who were not always diabetic. But as they age, their body doesn't respond to insulin the same way. Type 1 diabetes is tougher because these are folks who are born and their body doesn't manufacture insulin the way it should. So they're born with an issue. It's nothing that happens over time. They're born with it. And type 1 diabetes, the pancreas is malfunctioning. So their pancreas doesn't produce insulin the way it should. So stem cells, the hope is you could inject stem cells into a pancreas and allow that person's pancreas to then do what it's supposed to do. Because, again, this stem cell can be anything. It could be a pancreas cell. You know, there are other things that they hold out hope for stem cells being a cure for. Hold on. How do we go from being this stem cell, this thing that can do anything, to being one of these special cells? There has to be some kind of process. Like giving it away? There is a process. So the process, we'll shrink that down a little bit, is this differentiation. Let me move that over a little bit because I just wrote it. Let me move it over some more because I'm still out of room. It's amazing what you can do with this thing. Okay, so differentiation is this process that a stem cell has to go through before it can become something else. So a stem cell can be anything. It can take on any job. So this is kind of like you before you graduate from high school. You could be anything. You could go be a teacher, a nurse. You could be a farmer. You could be somebody you could drive a truck. You could do anything. All your options are open. Or hopefully a lot of them still are. If you go through very specific training, so let's say you graduate from high school, you decide you want to go join the electrician's unit, you want to wire houses. Okay. Once you've gone through that training process, you have a very specific job. Differentiation is kind of like a training process. Before you do that, you can do anything. All your options are open. Once you get that training, you have a specific job that you're going to stick with, we hope. So for these cells, once they go through differentiation, then it's a bone cell. It can't carry blood. It can't carry oxygen. It can't expand and contract. Or it's a skin cell. It's just skin. It's never going to be a blood cell. It's never going to be a muscle cell. It's not going to change jobs. So that is this idea of differentiation. Questions? So development, you going from being that little tiny miniature person who was probably 6 or 7 pounds and about this big to being you who we see now is through development, and that means that your cells divide and they differentiate. Okay? Your cells are constantly dividing and differentiating. Dividing and differentiating. And there is such a thing as an adult stem cell. We talk more about things like embryonic stem cells. We talk about bone marrow stem cells. There are stem cells in your bone marrow. When they do bone marrow transplants for some kinds of cancer, that's because of the potential of bone marrow. Okay. Now, let's talk about the really reproduction. I'll read it first. All living things can reproduce. Reproduction does not ensure survival of the individual, but is critical to the survival of the species. So every single thing that's alive is able to reproduce itself. That's one of the things we said. All living things can reproduce. What does it mean to reproduce? What does it mean to reproduce? What do you think, Jade?
Like, make more of the same thing.
Yeah, make more of you. Make more of you. Copying machines used to be called reproduction machines. When they were new, in the Stone Age, when I was a kid. And you'll see things that still say, like, repro machine. Yeah, you're reproducing something. You're making a copy of it. Reproduction doesn't change the odds of you surviving. So just because this tree tossed down a seed and that seed ended up on the ground and it sprouted, it doesn't mean the parent tree is going to live any longer. Just because this rat had babies doesn't mean she's going to live any longer. Just because, and this is my favorite example, these are little tiny fish in eggs. They haven't even hatched yet. So some female fish squirted a bunch of eggs on the bottom of a lake. Some male fish came across and squirted a bunch of sperm on top of that. Doesn't mean either one of them is going to live a second longer. But if none of them reproduced, there would be no more fish, there would be no more rats, there would be no more trees. So if some member of your species doesn't reproduce, your species ends. It just dies out. There are 2 basic ways to reproduce. Do you know what they are? Yes, it's okay to chuckle. Okay, sex. What's the other one? Ah, okay. You're thinking of just humans and actually the process of giving birth. That's all. Oh, no? Okay. I may have misunderstood you then.
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
Oh, okay, okay. Cesarean. Okay. But it's still sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. That's the other option, the no sex option. One cell splits and forms 2 cells. or one parent organism splits and forms two organisms. This gets you, so, means a line of identical organisms. Most common in single-celled organisms. Sexual reproduction. Two parents contribute cells to form one new cell, found in multicellular organisms. And this allows for new traits and diversity in offspring. Take your hands and make a fist like this. Two hands up in front like this. This is one single cell. I'm waiting for everybody. One single cell. In asexual reproduction, one cell splits into two. Okay, pretty easy, right? Now in sexual reproduction, two cells, you've got two cells now, join into one. Okay? So, asexual reproduction, if you were able to reproduce asexually, which you can't. You can't. Okay, so let's clear up the confusion on this. Let's clear up the confusion between the idea of sex, mating behavior, and sexual reproduction. Okay? So, fish. We described how fish reproduce. Female comes along, squirts a bunch of eggs on the bottom of the lake. Male comes along, squirts sperm over it. Those fish may never even see one another.
Ever again?
They may never even, she comes and squirts her eggs. 15 minutes later, he may come by and squirt sperm. They may not ever see one another.
Do they know,
who the father is?
Like a bass would not.
No. Yes, they do. Okay. Yeah. So like a bass isn't going to come along. No, you're right.
Shark and a bass.
Right. There are a couple ways that works. So for one thing, like all the bass spawn at one time of year.
Oh yeah.
Like the walleye spawn, for a few weeks, and then the crappie spawn, and So there's that. But also, each species, because the male is the one who makes the nest, and he makes a nest. He is doing this, and teenage boys do similar sorts of rituals in terms of trying to look really impressive for teenage girls. I watch it every day. Teenage girls do similar kinds of rituals of trying to look really impressive for teenage boys. Everybody's trying to impress everybody else. Fish are no different. But in fish, it's mostly the males who are trying to impress the females. So the males try to build a really beautiful nest. I don't know what a fish considers beautiful, but a fish does. Never been a fish. That I remember. So anyway, the male fish comes along and he makes this pretty little nest, and each species' nests are a little bit different. So the female smallmouth bass only comes along and she's only interested in a particular type of nest, and that's the type the male smallmouth make. So yeah, because like if a female bluegill laid eggs and a male bass came along and squirted sperm on top of them, it wouldn't work. Probably. For some species, it does. Like
cool.
you can cross sauger and walleye. You can make a hybrid. They're called a sawguy.
Walleye's good.
I love walleye. Northern pike and muskie can be crossed. They're closely enough related. Well, Division of Wildlife did this years ago. They called them tiger muskies, and they tried a breeding program. So the kind of program I worked on where we were squeezing fish for eggs and sperm, except they collected, gently, but yeah. Did you miss that day? Stick the fish's nose in your armpit, hold their tail here, take hand cupped like this and run it up along the belly over a bucket, and the female squirts out a stream of eggs into the bucket. You squirt then about 10 females' eggs into a bucket. You take one male, same thing, nose and armpit, hold his tail, rub his belly, and he squirts sperm all over the bucket. And then you stir up the bucket, and it goes to the hatchery.
You stir it up?
Yeah, not with your hand. You use a wooden spoon. I mean, you wash it before you make the Kool-Aid, but that was a joke. That was a joke.
I'm not going to be able to drink Kool-Aid.
I'm sorry. I'll ruin more things for you, I promise. Okay, so getting back to the distinction between sex and sexual reproduction. Those fish never see one another. Did the fish have sex?
No.
No, not in the way that we think of sex as mating behavior. They never saw one another. They certainly never touched. There was no kiss on the fish lips. However, they reproduced sexually. How is it sexual reproduction?
Because it mixes their eggs.
Mixing eggs and sperm. Two different cells forming one. That's sexual reproduction. So just because they never saw one another, just because there was no fishy lips, it's still sexual reproduction.
What? Isn't.
I'll hit pause.
Don't we? Like.
You're allowed to be and say it. If you're confused, I want you to say it. So let's draw our little bacterial cell again. And it's got, bacteria actually have, this is, it's all of their genetic information. It's all their genes. Okay? We're not going to, we haven't talked yet about DNA. You may have picked up some stuff. It's basically a little piece of chemical information. That one cell starts to add cells to it, or that one cell starts to add, it grows. The cell gets a little bit bigger. And then it sort of pinches off in the middle. And that little thing there splits in half.
Is that a nucleus that splits?
Well, it's not a nucleus because these don't have a nucleus, but good. So that little thing, that little piece of genetic information splits. And then the genes, well, no, it reproduces the genes too. So it ends up, but there's a moment, yeah, it ends up being the same size. But there is a moment where you have two things that are smaller, and then they grow to full size. So it's called binary fission. We'll talk about it when we talk about cell reproduction.
Okay, so like even fish go through sexual reproduction.
Fish go through sexual reproduction. Raccoons go through sexual reproduction. Earthworms go through sexual reproduction. Insects go through sexual reproduction. Ask Mrs. Haylett about dragonfly penises.
That's what I was going to ask you, is how do they reproduce?
Dragonflies?
Yeah, they mate.
Oh, they do. They mate while they're flying, and then the female has a little structure on the end, so they fly around with him clasped onto her. They do touch. There's all kinds of dragonfly touching. And they fly along. If you watch on a summer afternoon, you'll see these two dragonflies that look like they're playing piggyback while they're flying. They're not playing piggyback. And so he inserts the sperm packet into her abdomen. It's a packet. It's like a little package in the U.S. mail service. Yeah, it's called a sperm packet. He inserts it into her abdomen. She releases her little egg packet. The eggs get fertilized, and then she flies along. She's got a little structure, and she dips her little structure in the, well, it depends on the species. Some dip it into the water, and some of them lay them on the stems of aquatic plants, like cattails and stuff. And Mrs. Haylett, her master's degree is in biology, and she's squirrely, you know. She and I are good friends. I like her a lot. She had to do a piece of original research on something, and she was getting really fed up, and she said, fine, I'm doing it on dragonfly penises. So she did. And they have all different shapes and stuff. There's a whole lot more to dragonfly penises than you would think. So anyway, dragonflies, do it. Look it up. Go look up dragonfly penises and whale nipples, absolutely. Not on the school network. So dragonflies reproduce sexually. Earthworms have earthworm eggs and earthworm sperm. They reproduce sexually. Not a whole lot of things can reproduce asexually. It's uncommon. And mostly it's single-celled things. Mostly it's stuff like bacteria. There are a few multicellular things that can split like that, but not many. So for the most part, this asexual reproduction is going to be things like bacteria. Most bigger stuff reproduces sexually. Let me just hit this highlight and then we'll hit questions. So Monday, we are going to do a review of this whole packet. Tuesday, you're going to have a quiz on this whole packet, and then we're starting into our new unit, okay? So that's the agenda for Monday.